My Lords, it is a great pleasure to follow my noble friend Baroness Monckton of Dallington Forest, although the pleasure is allayed slightly by the fact that I cannot hope to the rise of the excellence of her speech, which I hope the Minister will have observed very carefully, but perhaps he was too busy. My Lords, like my noble friends Lord Howard of Rising and Lord McKinley of Richborough, I must declare an interest as an employer. With the proposal to further raise employers' NIC, the government seems to want to pursue in a manner that really is hard to understand or explain, yet another way to damage the economy. I rise to offer the government a few morsels of attempted sanity. Taxing business at higher rates, making it more difficult to start up, maintain or expand a business, was, I very much am afraid to say, tried by the recent Conservative government over the last few years, and it didn't work. In the period 2023 to 24, the economy ground to a halt. Now, this new government is trying the same approach. How can we possibly expect the outcome to be any different this time? Over the past 18 months or so, doing research for a book I've been writing, I've been studying the available literature on the impact of taxes on economic growth. The clear consensus is that the taxes that hit the economy the worst are taxes on business, and the business taxes that have the most negative impact on employment are, surprise, surprise, employment taxes. The clue is in the name, employers' NIC, those employers, you know, the ones who employ people. Many employers would be happy if they could employ others merely out of the goodness of their heart, but that's not how the world works for the private sector. To keep a private sector enterprise going, a profit must be made. For that, taxes can't be too high, or else the cost of employing an employee becomes prohibitive, the business loses money, and then it has to close down. So the first law of taxes: don't tax business so high that the employers can't afford to employ the employee. Yet, that's exactly what the increase in employers' NIC does. So why on earth has our new government decided to raise employment taxes to a new high? I discern three possible reasons. First, to achieve economic growth. That's what the government say their number one objective is. So in theory, they must have thought that increasing these tax rates would increase economic growth. The second possibility, a less noble one, to find the money to pay off their allies. After all, politics involves trade-offs, so perhaps that's why they need to do this. Or a final possibility, it's just not them in charge. Rather, they're in the grip of the fabled Treasury orthodoxy, taking their orders from officials at the dreaded OBR and the Treasury. Well, let's look at these three possibilities. First, that they're doing it to achieve economic growth. Certainly that has been the Prime Minister's and the Chancellor's chant. Growth, 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 both during the election and ever since. The trouble is, this government have never laid out their theory of what actually creates growth. Beyond discreditable tropes about green jobs whose numbers will have little impact on the long-term economy, this government have been unable to figure out what it is they have to do to achieve growth. Yet it's standing clearly in front of them. The repeated conclusion of every study on growth. To grow an economy, you need government expenditure in the low 30% or less of GDP, with tax revenues at around the same low 30% level. And you need light regulation that allows businesses, indeed all enterprises, to get on with the job of providing the goods and services that the market wants at a decent price and good quality without having to spend all their time jumping through regulatory hoops. That's it. Economies with public sector expenditure levels like ours in the mid-40% of GDP and taxes at the same high rate and ever-increasing regulation just don't grow fast, if at all. So if this new government really wanted to grow fast, they'd be full of plans to shrink expenditure, to tax less, to regulate less. On all three dimensions, they're doing the opposite. The conclusion that either the claim that they're all for growth is just a chant, a slogan for this government, not really meant, or they are so inept that despite their truly wanting the economy to grow, you have to believe they do, they have no clue that increasing employers' NIC will have exactly the opposite effect. I wrote an article for a Sunday newspaper yesterday citing the instance of a friend running a 35-person high street business who, just to stay afloat after these tax hikes, is having to fire 2 of his employees. He was planning to raise his headcount by 2 before this. The comments section below my article had entries from business owners claiming that they're too in similar circumstances, having to fire people. Or worse, saying that the higher tax impost meant, as my noble friend Baroness Monckton also described, that they're having to close down their entire business. As an interposition, I spoke to this friend of mine who's having to fire 2 people this morning, and he told me, well, I've been having difficulty figuring out how to fire 2 people. Obviously, it wouldn't be great on either of them, but luckily, one of them resigned today. And I said, oh yes, where's that employee going? And in an absolutely uncanny echo of what my noble friend Lord Horan was talking about earlier, he said, well, she's gone to work for a local council and she's being paid more. She can work from home for 3 days a week. On top of being paid more, she's getting that wonderful golden defined salary, defined benefit pension. She's allowed to work home 3 days a week. What else? Oh, she gets a year's paid maternity leave. My lords, where's that money coming from? Where's the money coming from that allows these local councils, and indeed the government, the public sector in general, to pay for all of this? Because the fact is, the money isn't there. My noble friend also talked about the fact that we are now below the middle of the advanced economies in terms of GDP per capita. A while back, we were vying with America to be the best GDP per capita in the world. The noble Viscount Chandos probably would have described the situation of this new public sector employee as fair, because after all, that's what she would need to have a great life. But my lords, the money isn't there for what the benches opposite always like to describe as fair. The benches, noble lords on the benches to my left, have an inexhaustible list of societal needs that must be paid for. The noble Lord Eatwell rightly decried the decline in our armed forces expenditure, but the money isn't there. Why isn't it there? Well, precisely because of the high tax, high spend, high regulation policies that governments, I'm afraid, of both sides of this House have pursued over the last 25 years. And during that 25 years, we haven't grown precisely because of spending money on what was fair, on spending money on what was needed, rather than on spending money that we actually had. And as a result, our economy has not grown. Had we grown more, had we grown, say, at the same rate as the United States did during that time, our economy would now be 40% larger than it is right now. The money would be there. There, my lords, is your needed money, the money that comes from economic growth. There is the economic growth which this government's tax increases will instead throttle. But it's not just my friend and his small business. There are literally, as has been described today, millions of organisations affected by this tax raise. Not just SMEs, but charities, NHS general practices, the arts and so on. Employment losses will over time be in the hundreds of thousands. I offer the government a gentle hint. Economic growth comes despite what I saw as a valiant attempt by the noble Lord Eatwell to assert otherwise. It comes from increases in employment, not decreases. The second hypothesis as to why the government sees it as necessary to impose this NIC hike is that having paid off their allies so lavishly in the first few weeks after the election, they now need to find the money to pay for this. A 15% for train drivers, 22% for junior doctors. And still those friends of theirs threaten to go right back on strike. With friends like these, my lords, well, it's certainly true that these expensive commitments, along with so much money about to be poured down the drain on placating the Green crowd, and money to satisfy other allies who think that the answer to the world's problems is more and more regulation, so that a new regulator or quango is being brought into existence for every week so far that Labour has been in power, means that an awful lot of money is being spent, and with the civil service expanding in its thousands by week, there are no savings in sight to help the government pay for all these extra commitments. So we come to the third and final hypothesis, that the government has been told what to do. Without any serious experience in this area, you therefore have no option but to succumb to your officials. But that in turn is driven by the OBR. These know not much more about business and the economy than does the government, the blind leading the blind. The government has created this problem. It increased expenditure during its budget by £70 billion. Even with an increase to employers' NIC, only half of that increase would be covered by additional taxes. And even that amount is only true if you believe the estimation of how much extra tax will be collected. It is, in fact, even worse than this. There's a large extra amount of expenditure that the government and the OBR have persuaded themselves can be categorised in the national accounts as some form of investment, so it's not included in the published deficit numbers. But every penny of that so-called investment money will have to be found through additional borrowing, which added all together brings the additional level of borrowing needed to pay for this to an extra 50 billion or so pounds. And that's assuming the economy grows at forecast, which I say to this House is something that an NIC hike makes quite unlikely. The OBR asserts that on net some £15 billion will be raised from this NIC hike. They do acknowledge, albeit to far too small a degree, that employment will decline as a result of this tax increase. That should make Labour hang its head right there. But if the government abandoned the NIC raise, the OBR would therefore say that creates a further £15 billion hole. So the government is doing what it has been told to do, and thus it proceeds with this NIC raise. The Growth Commission, however, has contradicted the OBR's calculation and calculated that the long-term impact of this tax increase will be negative £18 billion. And that's even before you get into the social and economic disruption of large numbers of people being laid off. So, to answer the noble Lord Macpherson, who's not in his seat, and the noble Lord Eatwell, you pay for this by not doing it. Surely, in his extensive and distinguished public life, the noble Lord Macpherson must have understood that ever-increasing tax and spend just doesn't work. So what's the conclusion? We have a new government. They came, they saw, they paid off their allies. They, without clear detail, claimed a pre-existent £22 billion black hole, but this claim only served to make their options more constrained. They've accepted what they've been told to do by their officials, but imposing this tax is actually going to make the economy's position, and with it the government's, much worse. They still don't appear to have a clue as to what they need to do to get economic growth going in this country. I thank the noble lady. I'm almost finished. I earnestly entreat the government to set out on a search for an economic growth
My
plan.
Lord, I'm so sorry, but you have now spoken for over 15 minutes, and I suggest you bring your remarks to a close.
I just informed the noble lady that I was about to finish, and I would have finished by now had she not interrupted a second time. I would remind her that it's an indicative time. And one interruption.
Companion states.
One interruption.
The backbench, my Lord, the companion states the backbench
I
contributions
thank the
are limited
noble
to
lady.
15
It is an
minutes.
indicative time. I will finish. I will finish. I entreat the government to set out on a search for an economic growth plan that relies on the facts about growth, not the unsupported feelings that currently seem to drive their decision-making. I thank the noble lords for their attention.